Hello. Greetings, everyone. I'm checking my audio levels. Okay, that seems to be doing the thing. If you are here in chat, let me know if I appear to just be talking, but there's no sound, or if anything else is up with the video or audio. That's the way that these things are. It's been a little while since I streamed because I have been up to, let's say, about here in Daggerheart very happily. But a Blades in the Dark expansion just arrived on... Ooh, probably getting double audio. I will cut that out. Hey, everybody. I haven't streamed in a while, but I'm back now because John Harper, creator of Blades in the Dark, just released a setting and systems expansion for the game called Deep Cuts. And the implications for Forged in the Dark design are very big. I'm tweaking that so now you can see the more of the book. So yeah, this is a 118-page expansion that came out, I think, just yesterday, right? I saw it on an itch.io email notification. And then I took a look at it and started talking about it, and other folks had also just started talking about it. So I have spent maybe 15, 20 minutes glancing through the rules part just to get a very initial sense of things. But my plan here is to jump to the rules section, go through things with a bit of more detail, look at the designer notes, which I saw are at the end in terms of Harper talking about the how and why of their process in building these rules modules as options for changing how things work in Blades. And then depending on how I'm feeling and how many folks there are and what people are interested in, I might jump back and take a look at some of the setting stuff. I am very curious about the catalyst, which is listed, which seems like it is a campaign frame or campaign escalation element that you can introduce. So I'm curious about that. I've played a lot of Blades and I've run a lot of Blades, but my interest, I think, today is more with Forged in the Dark design more broadly, right? Because Blades came out in 2017. There was a Kickstarter. There was already a lot of development between when the Kickstarter happened and when the game came out. And then Harper has been continuing to create some support material for Blades, but this is the biggest, here is a chunk of rules ideas that you can use, or things like that. The Dagger Isles supplement, as far as I know, is still in development and maybe coming to crowdfunding in the next year, ? So I'm excited about that as well. But Deep Cuts is the thing that we have here right now, and so I'm excited to dig in. We're going to jump there, and I'm going to take a look at... Just going to move this a little bit, and then that. And we'll see if this covers everything that we want it to. So, quick credit stuff, right? This is Harper. We note some Dagger Isles heritages and names by Pam Punzalan and some design consultants. And then thanking some people in TTRPGs and actual play and other stuff like that. So, overview. We've got innovations in technology. Lots of factions, including 15 that were mentioned in Blades but didn't get full write-ups. And 12 new factions. 100 heritage and background options. And then this catalyst, quote, introducing a world-shaking element which expands and alters the setting of the game, along with dark secrets to explore and opportunities for scoundrels to exploit. So that sounds pretty cool. And then the second section is a collection of 6 systems for the game. These are all modular, so you can use one, a few, or all of them together, depending on what your group prefers. We have a modified advancement system, revised harm and trauma, a diceless downtime system, and a new action system which overhauls and streamlines the action resolution mechanics to empower players even more and speed up the process of play. So that's a direct quote here as I read this. So that's a lot of stuff, 118 pages. This is currently only available in ebook/digital form. What I saw last night from Harper was that there are currently no plans for a physical edition. Who knows if that changes in the future? That's not really the thing that we're up to today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to scroll down to this rules section, and we're going to start there. So if quick scrolling is going to make you unhappy, this is your fair warning, right? So I'm going to give you another couple seconds. And now here we go. I'm going to be scrolling. So we're going to go down. Okay, here we go. So that's the harm module. Part 2 systems. Great, here we are. Quote, this module makes harm more flexible and impactful and provides a new way to earn XP. When your character suffers harm, record it in your playbook according to its level. Level 1 harm is now listed as temporary condition, a negative effect that goes away naturally over time and doesn't require treatment. Bloodied, confused, distracted, intimidated, exposed, seduced, stunned, tired, terrified, weakened. So I've seen some other Force in the Dark games look at harm and reevaluate how harm works, either make it less of a core element of the game or change some of how recovery works, right? I've changed recovery to make it go notably faster in the Genrenauts RPG. Current working title is Let's Go Steal an Ending. We'll see on that. I wrote up a list of probably close to 100 names in trying to come up with a name beyond just Genrenauts. Because, right, with Genrenauts, you sort of have to understand the construction of astronaut to be able to understand what I'm doing. So it can be a little confusing for some people. But in Genrenauts, I had harm be easier to deal with and go away. And at least in some versions, level 1 harm would just go away after the end of a mission. So this is kind of in alignment with what I was thinking and what some other folks have done. I think in all of these, we're going to see some places where Harper has either seen what other people are doing and likes it and is putting it here, or had similar ideas based on their own time running the game and seeing people play it, right? So I'm not going to necessarily say that any one thing is or isn't influenced by anybody else unless there are specific notes to the contrary, where it does like say this directly is inspired by this other thing. So level 1 harm is now all temporary. Level 2 harm is lasting. Serious injuries, ailments, or impairments. Beaten up, blasted, broken arm, burned, concussion, cursed, electrocuted, slashed, stabbed, shot in the leg, knocked out. Severe harm, or level 3 harm is now severe harm. Major wounds which can incapacitate a character or even threaten to become fatal if not treated. So that's pretty similar, right? Bleeding out, broken ribs, deep stab wound, poisoned, cracked skull, shot in the chest. And level 4 harm is fatal. A mortal wound or instant death, depending on the situation. Right? Stabbed in the heart, disintegrated, drowned in the void sea. It says you have space on the playbook to record 2 instances of level 2 harm and 1 of level 3. If you suffer harm at a level that has all of its instances filled, the harm advances to the next highest level of severity. So that's similar. But you can have an unlimited number of level 1 harm conditions. But if you suffer the same condition a second time, it bumps up to level 2. So if you're tired and become tired again, erase it and take a level 2 harm exhausted instead, right? And then that exhausted can become a level 3 harm if all of your level 2 spots are full, and so on and so forth. But key changes here. Level 1 harm is temporary and will go away on its own. You can have as many level 1 harms as make sense fictionally. You can take the same level 1 harm again, and then that turns it into a level 2 harm. And yeah, so those are the key elements here, right? So this is the other big change. So invoking harm. Harm levels aren't tied to specific mechanical penalties. Quote, this is all quoted, sorry. Instead, harm can be invoked by the GM to impede the character, creating a problem or limitation for them. When you invoke harm as the GM, choose one. Introduce a bad outcome or a new problem for the character. Reduce an action and or attribute rating for a role. Reduce the character's position or effect. Right, so reduce an action or attribute rating. That is more similar to what level 2 harm was in original Blades. Reduce the character's position or effect. Reduced effect was the level 1 harm result. Now, harm doesn't automatically do anything to a roll unless the GM invokes it. And when the GM invokes harm, that character marks XP. And we say, quote, feel free to remind the GM of your character's harm when you think it might apply to a situation. So here we've got a few examples, right? And these, notably, are examples using characters from Haunted City, the glass cannon actual play of Blades in the Dark, right? Josephine, Ross, and Abu, their characters Juliet, Ekprag, Wodi, and Valkos. So that's pretty fun, right? We know that Harper is fond of the Haunted City actual play because they've talked about it. But it's fun to see that kind of showing up, right? This is game informs actual play and then shows back up in game or game material. So that's fun. Tough it out. If you think the consequence from an invocation of harm is too punishing, basically if you don't want to accept the invocation of harm, you can tough it out and take 1 stress per level of the harm and draw a line through it. You still have the harm and need to recover from it, but it can't be invoked to impede you, right? So I'm in a scene, I take a broken arm, and then I try to do something, and the GM says, well, because of your broken arm, you're going to have reduced effect. I could then say, oh, I'm going to tough it out, and I'm going to take 2 stress because it's level 2 harm, and put a line through that broken arm harm so that it can't be invoked anymore. Whether that is, it can't be invoked this mission or can't be invoked at all, right? I don't know that that's necessarily firmly established here. I'd have to go back and read like in a lot of detail, but we're going to go a little bit faster here. So that's very interesting. It moves the responsibility for remembering harm more onto the GM, but also gives the GM a lot of flexibility in how they do or don't want to invoke that harm. Right, you can, let's see, where's the invoke harm for a new challenge? Yeah. So Ekprag has enthralled. The GM invokes this harm to create a problem. Ekprag is too engaged in the dalliances to notice one of the guards slipping away to inform the crew. Right, so that is just, I'm going to invoke your harm to create a new challenge or to create a consequence. And up here, the GM invokes harm to introduce a bad outcome. Julia is too injured to flee the scene without assistance. She'll have to get some help or talk her way out of this one, right? So level 3 harm traditionally means that you can't act without pushing yourself. So this is a little bit similar to that. But what this does is it makes harm a little bit less. It means you don't have to do it. You don't have to think about it all the time. What you do instead is you think really closely about the fiction. Right? That harm is something that is established in the fiction because the mechanics reflect the fiction, reflect the mechanics, and back and forth, right? Always returning to the fiction. So in the fiction, if I have a broken arm, what things could happen or what impact might it have on rolls? Blades GMs were already encouraged to think in those terms, but this is, I think, a less strict and more flexible system for engaging with harm, and it gives players some additional choice in how much they want to accept harm having an impact on them in a mission or in a scene, right? Because you can tough it out and cross out that harm so that it can't be invoked anymore. So you could think about this as now harm just makes you take stress, but it's not quite so direct, right? You take the harm, you write it down, the GM can then invoke it. And then when the GM invokes it, as the player, you can decide to accept that invocation, or you tough it out and you take stress. It doesn't remove the harm, but it means that fictionally it's no longer kind of informing the scene in a big, direct way. Right? So removing level 1 harm. Some level 1 harm actions might require an action to remove. You might need to take some time to rest. If you're bloodied, you might need to bandage your wounds. Others go away when it makes sense in the fiction, right? So sleeping when you're tired may not require a downtime action, but it might require you do something in the fiction, or it might require establishing that we've cut ahead far enough that that harm would kind of roll off. Excuse me. and there's a note here. If you suffer a mortal wound that isn't instantly lethal, you maybe have a chance to take that harm. And you would record a scar, a permanent injury. You may invoke a scar like it was harm, right? You may invoke a scar to impede your character and mark XP as if it were harm. Then this is the player getting to invoke it themselves, right? So this means when you take those nastier harms, but your character doesn't die, you can lead them, they can be left with a scar, which is then something you can go back to again and again, so that if you want to play a character who is getting worn down and scarred by harm and injury, that system is there and you can lean on it, which is cool. So with each of these modules, there are like specific notes about, hey, here's what in the existing game will change if you're using this module, right? Here's a special ability. Here are a couple things that relate to harm, and what changes you might make with them. Right. So the next thing is trauma. Quote, this module makes the immediate consequences of trauma less severe and provides a different way to earn XP. So in Blade's Core, when you fill your stress track, you take a trauma, you clear your stress, and your character is out of the scene or out of play for the rest of the score. I don't remember if the core book says one of those definitively or the other. I often have been doing it as you're out of the scene or you're out of the scene for some time, making it so that the immediate consequences are less severe. That certainly makes sense for me, thinking about what I've seen and what I've encountered in actual play. So when you need to mark stress, but all your boxes are marked, gain a trauma condition, mark one of your trauma boxes, then remove all your stress, circle a condition or create your own. Quote, describe your character's trauma reaction in the current circumstance. Decide how intense that reaction is and if it causes a problem for your character. You can then invoke trauma. Each of your character's trauma can be invoked once per session to create a problem or complication for them. When you do this, mark XP. Right? This feels similar to me to some other games where you take a disadvantage, and then if that disadvantage creates a problem for you in play, right, you get XP or you get some kind of bonus. This replaces end of session XP for trauma. I like this because it puts the question of trauma getting in your way more actively into play, and it gives even, again, a little bit more agency to the player to say like, hey, I think my trauma comes up here, and I think the system just kind of brings trauma a little bit more front of mind. But additionally, it says, before you get your fourth trauma box, you can recover from trauma, right? Quote, work with the GM to create a long-term project or other method to remove one of your conditions and clear a trauma box. Each character's trauma is personal, and so the path to recovery should be 2. In the core book, there was even less guidance on how you might get rid of trauma. It more assumes that trauma is pretty permanent. So this is a little bit of a note about tone, right? In other Forged in the Dark games, you might not want to have trauma work the way that it does in Blades in the Dark, a dark fantasy heist game about criminals and scoundrels. In Genrenauts, I replaced trauma with hang-ups, a little bit inspired by some of the systems in a science fiction game, I believe by Tom Bloom, which was on Patreon, but now hasn't gotten a release. It's like you're on Mars being like scoundrels and revolutionaries. But that had like harm and trauma work a little bit differently. And so I took some inspiration from that and from some other games and had filling up your stress track give you a hang up instead of trauma, right? A hang up could behave somewhat similarly to a trauma, right? You might be reckless as a hang up, but the language of hang up to me felt softer and more temporary, right? You can get over a hang up, and I'm not using the specific language of trauma, right? Because that is like that specific language in the field of psychology, right? And I don't have the training to be able to speak as in an informed of fashion as kind of using that terminology is here. This is a little bit different, but does soften the idea of trauma a little bit and opens up a bit more fictional and play space to the idea that trauma can be addressed, it can be ameliorated or compensated for by characters in the game, which I like. Okay, the next module is load. Quote, this module changes how items are chosen before and during the score. So this one I remember pretty well. There's notable changes here. You have two load options. You can be conspicuous or discrete. If you're discrete, you have 4 boxes of items available, but you can't take anything that is heavy. Heavy is a descriptor for items that take 2 boxes, right? So a heavy weapon, like a big 2-handed weapon, would probably be a heavy item. Armor is usually a heavy item, right? Because it takes 2 boxes. And then this kind of I remember what Harper said in the commentary, so I'm just going to bring it up here and then we'll get to look at it again later, that sometimes it strained credulity that a character would be wearing heavy armor, but nobody would notice it until fictionally it was relevant. Right? If you're wearing a chainmail shirt, it's easier to have that be on under something, but heavy armor is meant to be something bigger than that. So you can be discreet and have 4 boxes of items, or you can be conspicuous. You have 6 boxes of items available. You may bring heavy items, right? Heavy items, any item that requires 2 more boxes of load, but you must choose and mark heavy items before the score. So, right, if you're walking around in a score with a huge sledgehammer, you're going to be able to notice that the sledgehammer is there from the beginning of the score, right? The first time you see that character, that sledgehammer is going to be on them somewhere. And that makes sense, right? I think that there can sometimes be fun in the idea that someone was able to stash something away or they concealed it well. But in a lot of cases, it does make sense to go ahead and declare those heavy items at the beginning, and that helps maintain the integrity of the fiction a little bit more easily. I think depending on what your game's tone is, you may or may not want to apply that restriction. Maybe you already have another idea for load, or maybe you want it to be still a little bit more fluid. I think that these changes make a lot of sense for Blades in the Dark specifically, right? And these are all written as an expansion to Blades, less than here's some ideas for Forged in the Dark more broadly, at least as I've seen in the expansion so far, right? The expansion says that it's setting and systems Forged in the Dark, but it is Blades in the Dark : deep cuts. It's not Forged in the Dark toolkit or anything like that. So it is going to be primarily about Blades. If your scoundrel picks up something during a score, you can count as a load mark box. If you mark a 5th box, your character becomes conspicuous, even if they were discrete. And then if you go up to 7, you become encumbered, and that creates some more limitations. And here's, other kind of specific limitations. So 4 and 6 is conspicuous, like the discrete level is a little bit more load available than the normal kind of light load option. I've seen in a lot of other Forged in the Dark games, if they keep load, they tend to go to 2 levels instead of 3, which I think makes sense and is actually a change that I had recently made in the Genrenauts RPG, right? Looking at load and going, do I want this to be a little bit more streamlined? So this module is kind of already a little bit in alignment with what I was doing, and I'm definitely going to have a think about, do I want to go to 4 and 6? And then connected, do I want to include this language of heavy items and how you can only bring them if you're taking the heavier load or like the larger load, and have that limitation on heavy items if you are discrete, if you're bringing a less load. I already have some technology in the game that talks about being able to bring load, right? There's a special ability that is about basically blending in a situation, because you're like, oh yeah, I'm just a janitor, right? And I've got my 2-load janitor's kit, but I'm still inconspicuous because you would expect me dressed as a janitor to have this janitor's kit. And so that's not necessarily going to draw a lot of attention if it's plausible that a janitor would be in the situation that you're in, right? And this is thinking about how stuff applies in like heist stories. Leverage, the TV show, or Leverage Redemption, right? These are big touchstones for me in the Genrenauts books and in the game. And they will often have a character pose as a repair person or service person, like, electrician or a janitor. And the idea of, well, I'm supposed to be here, don't mind me, is a way that they can pass through boundaries and or escape notice, even though they're carrying around what would be a heavy load if we're thinking about things in Forged in the Dark terms. And then we've got some systems changes here, right? Applying to load limits and things like that. So rigging, you carry 2 free load of a particular class of item, including a heavy item when your load is discrete, if you want, right? So, okay, well, I have this rigging, and so I can be carrying it even though I'm on the discrete load. So here is advancement. This is, quote, this module slows the overall rate of player character and crew advancement. So with this, we institute the idea of advancement clocks. And these are 4 6-segment clocks, right? So we have 4 6-segment clocks up here. And you do this on the crew sheet. Whenever you mark XP, tick one of these clocks instead. To acquire an advancement, you fill a number of clocks as detailed below. When you gain the advancement, clear those clocks, right? So a new special ability from your playbook or crew sheet is 2 full clocks. So that's 12 XP. A veteran special ability, so a special ability from somebody else's playbook, is 3 clocks, which is 18 XP. A crew upgrade, those are like, oh, we have the rigging, or we got better, like we upgraded our cohort or something. That's 1 advancement clock, so 6 XP. And an action or attribute dot is 1 to 4 clocks. And the specifics here are basically, if you take an action from 1 to 2, right, that's going to be 2 clocks. And if you take an action dot and it's your first dot, but it means that your attribute increases, then you take a number, you have to spend a number of clocks equal to what that attribute will be. So here, going from 1 to 2 prowl, that's 2 clocks. Here, going from 0 to 1 sway increases resolve from 1 to 2, and so that would also be 2 clocks. That means that filling out your character to the point where they have 1 action rating in every action in an attribute, I was like, oh, okay, if I'm going to have 4 resolve to make my resists real much stronger, that would be 4 advancement clocks. So it's a lot more XP to round out your character within a given attribute. And then that is as expensive as going from 3 to 4 in an action. So the amount of XP that it takes scales up, right? Adding your second or third dot in an action costs more than adding your first dot. Taking the 4th action in a attribute costs more than taking the first or the second. And so that slows down a little bit of the process of the characters getting both incredible at their specialty and being amazing all-arounders. That is something that I noticed happening in the 30-ish session Blades in the Dark campaign that I ran on Start Playing, is that by the end of that campaign, pretty much all the characters were great all-arounders and were top of class in a few actions that were their specialty. And that was fine. It just meant that I had to adjust how I was GMing the game. This process is intended to slow things down, and I think it would, in fact, slow things down. And this might be really useful for folks intending to do longer-term play and longer-term actual play in Blades in the Dark or in Forged in the Dark games more broadly. Court of Blades, I remember specifically, made the action and coterie sheets XP tracks longer, right? It was 8 XP for an action instead of 6, 10 XP for your coterie instead of 8. I borrowed that structure for the Genrenauts game, and I think it does slow things down, but not quite to the same degree as this. And the thing I like about this is that it makes a coherent and consistent system, and it gives additional weight / makes it harder or slower to do that going deep or going wide thing in building out your characters. Right? With any of these, I would want to do some playtesting with them rather than just kind of looking at them here. So this is, it's not the first look because I did a little bit looking at stuff last night, but it is an early look as I start to process and think through some of these and see if I think any of them are something that I would want to bring to the Genrenauts game. Okay, downtime. This is one of the bigger ones. So I may not look at all of this in full detail because a lot of it is related specifically to the Blades downtime parts, and that is maybe a little bit less my specific focus here. I'm more thinking about Takeway for Forged in the Dark more broadly, at least in this pass. Right, crew phase. First, each cohort heals 1 level of harm, then resolve fallout, payoff. Okay, so not only does level 1 harm fall off, I think that means that if I got a level 3 harm in the mission, we go to downtime, and in the crew phase, that level 3 harm becomes level 2 harm instantly. We'll see if there's a further downtime action about recovery, or if this is just saying, hey, try making it so that harm just automatically goes down 1 step every job, instead of having to engage with the healing mechanics. Right, so GM assesses the fallout from the score in the form of faction status changes and the amount of heat gained. Right, so do you gain or lose status with a faction? And then heat, here's some calculations about getting heat. Excuse me. Determine payoff, rep gained, and any additional coin. Right, payoff is 1 coin per PC plus coin equal to the target's tier times 3. I remember one of the notes was that Harper says that they tend to give out higher coin rewards than they've seen some other GMs do. So if you have a party of 4 PCs, and so this is the very beginning of the game, right? You're tier 0, you have 4 PCs, and you're going after a tier 1 target. That's 4 coin for the PCs, and then target's tier times 3 is 1 times 3. 4 plus 3 is 7. So as a baseline, a tier 0 group going up against a tier 1 target with when they have 4 PCs is going to be 7 coin. That definitely increases, right? If you are tier 0 and going after a tier 2 target because you're really ambitious and or you've planned well and gotten some assets that are going to let you be able to contend with those challenges more evenly, then your party of 4 gets 4 coins plus the quantity 2 times 3, right? Tier 2 times 3, that's 6. So that'd be 10 coin. So your starting crew is likely to be going after tier 1 or tier 2 targets, and they would get 7 or 10 coin. And then as you move up in tier, right? If you're tier 1 and you're going after a tier 3 target, that's 9 coin plus 1 per PC. Rep. 1 rep for every 2 heat generated by the score. So that means generating heat is bad because you don't want heat, but it's also good because you make a big impression, and generating heat also gets you rep. And you get plus 1 rep per tier of the target above the crew's tier, right? So again, our tier 0 crew going after a tier 1 target, they're going to get a base of 1 rep just from going after somebody who's bigger than them. And then they'll get 1 rep for every 2 heat generated by the score. Seized assets. Take plus 4 coin if you seize a load of cash. Very valuable items can be fenced for 2 to 8 coin, but you take 1 heat for every 4 coin of value, right? If you steal a bunch of stuff and then fence it off, that's going to draw attention because you're making big transactions in a way that's going to maybe draw more attention from, like, I don't know if Duskwall has like an IRS, but it would certainly draw attention from like the investigators and the bluecoats. If you're tier 2 or lower, you pay a tithe to your ward boss, right? So this tithe is something that's in core Blades, but often gets left out. So here we have a new system for keeping track of that. Vaults and banks. So you can have a bank, and then when you have wanted levels, you lose access to your bank, right? Because this is more like legit banking, or it's a less legit bank, but when you're wanted, the people are like, hey, just don't just walk into our bank and try to withdraw things, right? We're going to have to work around it some. And then we've got a couple of example bankers. Entanglements. If the crew's heat is 6+, or when the fiction demands, right? Follow the fiction. The GM brings an entanglement into play. When the crew marks a wanted level, mark crew XP and pick blue coats as the entanglement. So when you gain a wanted level, you're encouraged to just straight up pick the blue coats. And then the blue coats will mess with you depending on your wanted level. So at low levels, it's questioning, harassment, threats. They start trying to beat you up, and it gets worse and it gets worse. And then if you're wanted level 4, they are just going to try and absolutely destroy you, right? Lethal force, arrests, or destruction and seizure of all lair and assets. So that could be a campaign-ending entanglement if the blue coats are able to hit you that hard. And then here's some other entanglements. So note that we don't have a role about entanglements in this system, and you only get them if you're at heat of 6+. I can understand that as we pulled this off perfectly. Almost nobody knows what we did. We were really good. We didn't, kill anybody. Why do we still get an entanglement? I think in the core book, the idea was that no matter how sneakily you do it, when you push against the world is going to push back. And I buy that argument. I'll be curious to take this and think about it and then reflect on it for the Genrenauts game of, do I want to take that same approach of limiting entanglements but making them more up to the GM's choice? Do I want to do one of those but not the other? Is that randomness fun, or is it a place where it's easier to just trust the GM? Or maybe it's, here are the entanglements. If you want to randomize, here's a chart, rather than here's a chart to determine what your entanglements are, with then the implicit idea that you could also just choose, right? It's a little bit of a reordering of expectations in terms of, we're expecting you to use this chart versus we are expecting you to make a choice, but you could use a roll chart if you wanted. And development, this is about upgrading your crew. So instead of spending a lump sum of coin to raise into you invest in crew upgrades over time to improve, right? So that is bringing crew advancement, more of that attention to the fiction as expressed in these upgrades, right? How do you become a better crew? Well, you buy upgrades. A higher tier crew is going to have more and better upgrades than a lower tier crew. It concretizes some of the specifics of what makes that difference between crews of different tiers, as opposed to just being a more abstracted representation of your overall scale and crew's capabilities, right? Cohorts don't cost coin, they cost advances. And then here's some examples, right? You move your lair to the cellar of a hidden unabandoned distillery. This costs 10 coin, right? You spend money to acquire or acquire the stuff that you want or accomplish the changes, right? Moving your lair would be pretty expensive, right? Because you have to replace things, you have to covertly move things if you're becoming a hidden lair and things like that. So this means that you're not spending crew, or you're not spending coin in this lump sum fashion. You're instead spending it piecemeal. That means you don't have to save up as much, especially at higher tiers. You are spending that coin more consistently, investing in specifics, and it means that you're seeing benefits along the way. And that the crew advances can then go into other things, right? Your crew advances can go more into abilities and cohorts and experts because you're getting these upgrades from coin. So it changes some of the crew advancement, a lot of the crew advancement economy. But to advance, you still need to meet these requirements. Rep track is full, you have a strong hold on your current tier, and you possess the required number of upgrades and cohorts to advance. So does this mean you need cohorts? Let's take a look. It's going to be on the next page. So from 0 to 1, you have to have 6 crew upgrades and at least 1 cohort. It does mean that, right? 2 cohorts, 4 cohorts, 6. So this is a little bit more of a prescribed advancement process. Definitionally, a crew 1 tier has at least 6 crew upgrades and at least 1 cohort. A tier 3 crew has at least 12 crew upgrades and at least 4 cohorts, and so on and so forth. You can also spend coin to develop your status with a faction you're not at war with, right? You spend money to improve your relationship with them. You either come up with the way that you've done that, right? You spend coin on something that they would like, or you just give them coin, right? You kind of buy friendship with them, or you buy them off if you are in negative status with them. So this is all still downtime, right? In the crew phase, you assess your heat and hold. You can reduce heat. For each +2 status you have with a tier 3 or higher faction, you can reduce your heat by 1, right? Because they have influence and they can get things off your back. You assess your hold. Hold is measured by your number of turf claims, right? So this is hold stuff, which is not as much my focus in the Forged in the Dark things. Scoundrel phase, right? So we have crew phase and then scoundrel phase. So this divides downtime into 2 sections, it looks like, at least 2 sections. So you finish your job, and then you have the crew scale of this is stuff that's everybody. And then the scoundrel phase is individual, right? Restore your armor and special armor. Remove all level 1 harm. If you have a safe place to rest, add 1 tick to your healing clock. So maybe you don't automatically step down level 2 harm to level 1 harm in this idea. You just clear level 1 harm. Rest of this downtime activities consists of vice and activities. Each player can do these in any order. Each pursuit includes a question or 2 to prompt role-playing. So vice, when you indulge your vice, spend 1 coin. So you have to spend coin. It's no longer free, but you clear all of your stress. And if you're stressed with 6 or more, you automatically overindulge. Your character suffers a complication depending on your roll. So you do roll here. Up 6, your vice costs a downtime activity. 5, your purveyor cuts you off. Face an entanglement. Something that we don't see here is you're not around, but you can choose to be lost to your vice instead of overindulge. So it means it's always a player choice. Instead of, hey, you don't get to play your character for this next mission, it can be, instead of overindulging, I'm going to have my character be off screen for this next mission or this next score, and then I'm going to introduce another character or whatever else that you do. So that's a pretty big change to Vice. It means that you can no longer do the Vice dance or the stress dance that I see some characters doing, and I absolutely have done, right? Because I was trying to play the game to its fullest, where you go, okay, well, if I get 6 stress, I can't overindulge because the highest amount of stress I can clear when I indulge my vice is 6. And so you would try to shoot for 5 or 6 stress to reduce the chances that you would overindulge. Here, you always clear all of your stress, but there is a penalty if you go up to 6, 7, 8 stress, right? You're getting close to filling up your stress track, is that you will overindulge. The cost of getting rid of all of that stress is that you overact or overreach in some way, right? Get wild, damage property, terrify citizens, take -1 status with an appropriate faction. You have to spend more money. You take more heat. You get an entanglement. Your purveyor cuts you off, or it costs a downtime activity. So, right, indulging your vice does not cost a downtime activity as a baseline, but it can if you overindulge. Right, so it's easier in that it doesn't cost you a downtime action automatically, but it's harder in that you have to spend coin. So there's a little bit of a trade-off there, and it silos indulging your vice off a little bit more from the other downtime actions. And now here are some downtime actions. Okay, so we do have recover still. So that makes me think that the earlier guidance was remove all level 1 harm, not remove all of your harm down by 1 level. There are 4 scoundrel downtime actions: acquire, recover, train, and work. So this is like a kind of a streamlined downtime system. If you have a level 3 harm or survived a mortal wound, you must use at least one of your downtime action activities to recover. Reasonable IMHO. Right? You're extremely wounded. You should probably do something about that. You probably have to do something about that. You get 2 free activities. Additional activities cost 1 coin or 1 rep each. Acquire. This is like acquire asset, right? Temporary items, services, vehicles, or cohorts. Make a 4-segment supply clock to be ticked each time it's used in a consequential way. Pay 1 coin for every quality higher than the crew's tier. Place plus 1 coin for a special feature. If the acquisition is really rare, ask the GM how much extra coin and or heat it costs. Generally, the whole crew gains access. So a thing about these downtime activities is you don't have to roll for them. You just do it. The kind of variability then, I think, is informed by this supply clock to be ticked every time it's used in a consequential way. So if you acquire an asset for a mission, you'll get to use it in some meaningful ways, but not infinitely within that mission. Right, you acquire the services of a Physiker, quality 3. Since the crew is tier 0, this costs 3 coin, right? So you can get those higher level assets, but it's going to cost you money. However, because it costs you money directly, you don't have to roll for it. So you don't get the thing of, okay, I'm going to acquire an asset. I really need tier 2, and then I roll lower and I have to spend coin to buy it up. It makes it more, you don't have to worry about the roll results. You know exactly what is going to be asked of you, right? And what the cost will be. Supply clocks can be used on a variety of applications. So a stockpile of products, blackmail secrets, favors. For significant expenditure, tick the clock multiple times, right? So if you acquire an asset that is like bribes or is blackmail, and you're like, oh, well, I want to blackmail a blue coat investigator. Well, that might tick your supply clock multiple times because they're a bigger deal or they're higher tier. That's very interesting. Recover. When you are in a safe location, you gain ticks on your healing clock. Your crew's tier +1. When your healing clock fills, reduce each instance of harm you have by 1 level. When you remove all harm, clear your healing clock. Right? So if you don't have any harm left, you don't get to have stored up healing ticks. Very sensible. If you also engage the services of a Physiker, they remove an instance of harm with a level equal to or less than their quality. Physicers on the playbooks are quality 2. So for each coin you pay, increase the Physiker's quality by 1. So if you have if you have Sawtooth, right, one of these contacts, and you do a recover action, you tick your healing clock equal to your crew's tier +1. If you also engage the services of Physiker, they just remove a harm. Your tier 0 crew can go to Sawtooth and remove a level 2 harm right away. Or if you have a level 3 harm, you could go to Sawtooth and pay a coin and remove a level 3 harm instantly. Instead of recovering on your home, you can stay in a private hospital. There are no public hospitals in Duskwall. Remove all of your harm and choose. Take 1 heat and pay 2 coin, or pay 3 coin. And then has the prompt. When you recover, how are you vulnerable? Do you show the pain of your injuries, open up to someone emotionally, or something else? I love these prompts. This is not surprising because we use prompts like that in Daggerheart. But it's great to have these things that are specific ways to kind of take the mechanics and return to the fiction and engage with the emotionality of the characters and their relationships to other PCs and to the world. Train. Use the activity to gain XP, to spend XP to get an advance. So you don't train to get XP, you train to spend it. You don't advance instantly as in standard blades. Describe a training montage. Love a montage. With an appropriate instructor, right? You don't just learn stuff out of nowhere. Then spend your XP. You can acquire an instructor, right? With the acquire activity. You can also choose this activity to act as an instructor in an area of your expertise. When you're an instructor, you may spend XP to advance. So, right, if I'm teaching other people how to do something, that may then allow me to solidify something that I had that I wasn't kind of quite as confident in, right? Teaching is a great way of learning. totally agreed on that. So you don't get the extra XP of training, and you have to spend the training actions to advance, and you have to have the fictional position for that advancement, whether that is an instructor or the opportunity to teach someone, which then will let you also learn as you're teaching. And the fourth action, work. Accomplish a simple project or work a side job to earn 1 coin. Ask the GM if you can charge more for your work, especially if you work for a higher action tier. For a long-term project, make an 8-segment clock. So projects are automatically 8 segments. When you spend an activity working on it, mark a number of ticks equal to your action rating. Add +1 tick if you have a workshop or other special advantages. So this removes the randomness of how much progress you're going to make on long-term projects. George, if you're watching, this is not explicitly for you, because I don't think John Harper knows about your project luck, but look at this. Remind me and or Tom when we play our next Forge in the Dark game that there's this option for long-term projects that don't involve rolling. You're welcome. George is a player who I play with who has notoriously bad luck completing long-term projects, and it's become a joke thing, right? So an 8-segment clock, you're a starting level character, you have an action rating of 2. So that would mean that without a workshop, it would take 4 actions to complete your 8-segment long-term project. That sounds about right? If you increase your action rating to 3, then you can finish it in 3 actions, right? 3, 3, 3 is 9. That overfills 8. If you have 4, which should be rarer because now, right, it costs more XP to go from 3 to 4, in addition to needing the material, like the upgrade options. If you have a 4, you could do a project in 2 actions, but also you add +1 tick every time you take that action if you have a workshop or their special advantages. There are some special abilities that say, always add +1 tick to your result when you do a long-term project. So if you had a workshop and that special ability as a starting character, and you used an action rating you have in 2, you'd be able to complete projects in 2 actions. That sounds pretty cool, right? All of this takes the rolling out of downtime, and then the exception for the rolling is when you overindulge during indulging your vice. Right, when you have that 6 or more stress, now you have to roll. Now this is really risky. This other stuff is much more consistent. You know what to expect going into it. It doesn't have as much of that uncertainty or randomness. So here are system changes, right? Here's all the stuff that's implied by it. Physiker, connected. There's some ability that's about downtime, right? Sinister Guile. I don't remember what Sinister Guile is. Right? Warehouses, you gain additional acquire activity, right? Because acquire has gotten a little bit more abstracted. Acquire asset, right? Well, information is an asset, but it's that just may feel a little weird. Going to acquire is like, oh, well, you acquire information. You acquire leverage. You acquire blackmail on somebody. So there's just a little bit of a change in framing and language. So that is a downtime module is a pretty big one. This action one is even bigger. So there's 2 big elements in this. And I think, because we've been going for just about an hour, I think I will do this action module, look at the the designer's notes, and then see if I have the kind of oomph and momentum to want to go ahead and take a look at the catalyst, which is the other thing that I'm interested in. All the setting stuff I'm sure will be cool. It's just not what I'm most interested in today, because I've already been working on the Genre Nuts RPG recently, and this thing came out. I was like, oh my goodness, new design technology. I want to look at this right away so that I can think about how I want to apply it, or if I want to riff on anything that Harper has done here, but do something different for my own game. So, action. Quote, this module overhauls the action system of the game to make it faster and more flexible by introducing the threat roll, which replaces the action roll, as well as modifying Devil's Bargains, resistance, gathering information, and teamwork. That's a lot. That's like, oh, here's an idea for changing the whole core systems, right? The main resolution mechanic is the action roll. Replacing it with the threat roll is a big deal here. So Harper says, the threat roll is an evolution of the common risky standard action roll. It emphasizes how the scoundrels avoid dangers they face during a score, rather than focusing on the success or failure of their actions. When you make a threat roll, the GM describes a bad consequence that's about to happen, and you take action to avoid it. This way, everyone knows the possible outcome before the roll. You don't have to create a new complication on the spot based on the result. You know what the complication is going to be ahead of time. It also gives clarity to the player of what the consequences would be. To get a bonus die, you can suggest an additional threat to add to the threat roll. This is sort of how Devil's Bargains work. You gain a bonus by getting into more trouble. After you make the roll, you assign a die result to each threat, so that when you, if you roll one good result, you get to choose which one to avoid and which one to suffer. So there's going to be examples down here later on, I remember, and we're going to focus on those. Position effect are also assumed to be risky standard for threat rolls. You only need to evaluate other positions or effect levels as an option in special cases, right? So this is reaffirming the idea that most rolls are going to be risky standard rolls. Is that the case in your game? Maybe not. If that's the case, if you often find that you have risky great rolls or desperate standard or desperate limited, that is a little different, and you're going to want to think about whether the threat roll makes sense for you, right? Does this make sense for your game? Devil's Bargain can be made in any situation, not just when a player is making a roll. GM can offer a player a bargain to accomplish a goal by proposing a cost, right? Oh, for a coin, he'll just do it. Oh, if you take a stress, you can just have it, right? We don't need to roll the dice about it. It's within your capability, but it's going to cost you something, right? It's going to cost you, or you're going to introduce a threat. Like, oh, well, you can do it, but then the blue coats are going to come after you, right? And that it means that there's mechanical discussion, but we're still really closely tied to the fiction, because we're not engaging the full dice system. We are at that place where fiction and mechanics are touching, but it's easy to touch it and then return to the fiction without a lot of interruption or friction. The push yourself mechanic and resistance roll are combined in this module. When you push yourself, you make an attribute roll and suffer some stress, 0 to 3, depending on the result. You can do this to reduce the consequences from a threat even after a roll, increase the effect of an action, or to activate a special ability. Those are the different things you can do by pushing yourself, right? Threat roll. So here's this new core system. When you face a negative consequence from a dangerous opponent or challenging situation, make a threat roll to see if you can avoid it. To make a threat roll, roll 1d for each dot in the action you're using, plus any bonus dice you have. Take the highest result. If you're facing multiple threats at once, add 1d to your pool for every additional threat, then assign a die result to each one. That means, mathematically, if you have a higher number of dice, but you're facing multiple threats, that's a big problem, because you don't get your full dice pool for each of those problems, right? We're going to have some examples down here, but to review real quick. A 6, you just do it and avoid the threat. On a 4 or 5, you suffer reduced consequence or have to push yourself to avoid the threat. On a 1 to 3, you have to suffer the consequence. But if you push yourself, you reduce the consequence. What this doesn't do is it doesn't say you fail to do the thing, right? So we look over here. You sneak into the manor through the skylight, but you might draw the attention of the guards, which would be ticks on the alert clock. So this is the consequence this is the threat you have to roll to see if you get to avoid it. What that means is that the GM is always saying, yes, but. You pummel the blue coat and knock him out, but during the fight you might take a bad hit, right? It is responding to the player's intentions by saying, yes, your character can actually absolutely do that, but here's something that might happen in the process. Now, if you're in a situation where the GM is like, I don't think you can just do XYZ, then maybe you don't use the threat roll, or you have some discussion beforehand. So let's look at our examples here before I get too carried away. Oscar is dragging a ghost. The GM describes 2 threats: electroplasmic energy backlash from the ghost, harm 2, and attention from the spirit wardens, ticks on some alert clocks. Oscar has 3 dice in a tune, plus 1 die because there's 2 threats. It is right, that's 1 additional threat, so you add 1 additional die. And he gets 6, 4, 4, 2. He assigns the 6 to the energy backlash, so he avoids this harm entirely, and 4 to the spirit warden's threat, so he reduces suffers a reduced consequence, 1 tick on the clock instead of 2. Right, this was 2 ticks up here, so you suffer a lesser version of the declared possible consequence. Or he might push himself to avoid that second consequence entirely, and we'll get pushing yourself down farther later on. To initiate a threat roll, the GM describes a bad consequence that's about to happen, and you narrate your scoundrel's response, right? Because in the conversation, when you're playing the scoundrel, you just say what you do. Right? There's a duelist here, right? I draw my sword and I'm just going to cut them down. And you go, okay, well, the GM might say, but, right? So here's the thing. She might cut you down before you can react. So there's a couple ways of doing this here, right? If your scoundrel's action initiates the threat, the GM first describes your effect and then defines the possible bad consequences so you know the risk result. You can do this, but you might do that. I'm curious about the X might happen before you do it, because that's a different order, right? Against a superior threat in Core Blades, you might have to make a resistance roll before you even get to act. You search the office to find the hidden files, but the servants might catch you in the act, right? So these are, you do X, right? You can't accomplish X, but Y might happen. Based on your description, the GM proposes an action to use. If the proposed action doesn't fit, you say what action you're using instead. If your group can't agree, the player has final call. In some cases, you can use other ratings when you make a threat roll, like an attribute, crew tier, or lifestyle. And we'll get to that later, or the book will get to that later. This really makes sense for actual play, because a lot of the time, the GM should have an understanding of what action is being used from the way that the player is describing it. Oh, well, right, we're face to face. I'm going to pull out my sword and cut them down. Oh, okay, so you're going to skirmish. Oh, no, I wasn't going to skirmish. I'm going to do finesse. That doesn't sound like you're describing something that's finesse. What it does is it saves me, often the GM, from the extra step where I say, it sounds like you're doing X, but what action are you using? Or if I'm according to Core Blades, the better practice is, okay, what action is that? Or what action are you using to accomplish that? Instead, I can say, if you're going to cut the blue coat down, that sounds like skirmish, right? And then it's on the player to say, oh, I was thinking finesse because X. It can save you one back and forth, which can be especially nice in actual play, because there's already a fair amount of discussion for one roll in a Forged in the Dark game, unless it's a very straightforward risky standard action. This threat roll idea pushes more stuff toward being this one risky standard kind of roll. So that's another place where theoretically things are getting streamlined and sped up. The GM can add additional threats from environment, NPC strengths, or supernatural effects. Additional threats act as bonus dice to your roll, but you have to assign a result to them, so you're in more danger. But by adding more dice, you're more likely to avoid any single threat. If you're facing a really bad consequence, suggest possible additional threats to the GM to increase your dice pool. Okay, so I'm just blasting away, firing and reloading as possible. Can I add the threat that I run out of ammo? Right? And so that's it's sort of like a devil's bargain. Hey, can I get a bonus die here because I might run out of ammo? Well, you get the +1 die to your action, so you're more likely to be able to do a main thing that you want, but then there's the chance of this other consequence happening, and unless you roll really well with multiple dice, you're probably going to have to accept one consequence to a certain degree. Or, quote, I really don't want to get possessed by this ghost. Can I add the threat that I suffer harm by jumping out the window? Right, you're going, I want a bonus die so that I can avoid the possession, but what if there's this possible danger elsewhere? And we have that possibility to push yourself to avoid or reduce a consequence, depending on the outcome of the threat roll. When you push yourself, you make a roll using the attribute, right? That's the same as a resistance roll. But this is a different results chart. You only take 0 stress on 2 6s. In Core Blades, you would take 0 stress if you got a single 6. If you get one 6, you take 1 stress, a single stress. On a 4-5, you take 2. On a 1-3, you take 3. In Core Blades, if your highest result on a resistance roll was a 1, you would take 5 stress. So it was more swingy. With this push yourself, the floor on stress cost is higher at your result of 1-6, but the ceiling on stress cost is much lower. The ceiling is 3 instead of 5. It means that you're more consistently going to take some stress to push yourself and resist consequences, but you're less likely to take this huge dollop of stress all at once for one thing. And that seems very interesting. It makes sense in terms of being a little bit less random, so it's a little more predictable for the player, knowing like, oh, well, if I push myself here, the worst it could be is costing 3 stress, but it's almost guaranteed to cost me 1 stress, because getting 2 or more 6s is really rare, unless your attribute rating is getting really high, right? With 2 dice in an attribute, your chances of rolling 2 6s is 1 in 36, right? Because you need a 1 in 6 and a 1 in 6 at the same time. Your chances of getting at least 1 6 on 2 dice are much higher. That should be 1 in 3, because it's a 1 in 6 chance plus a 1 in 6 chance, not a 1 in 6 chance times a 1 in 6 chance. If you're a statistician and I'm wrong, I apologize. I'm not a statistician. I'm just a game designer, and sometimes I fuck up. You also roll to push yourself to achieve certain abilities, like use your special abilities. So I could also say, right, instead of when I was thinking of like the superior opponent thing, I could go, oh, okay, well, this assassin is so skilled, you're gonna have to push yourself before, like, just to try to act against her, right? And then I'll go, okay, it's like a resistance roll. I push myself, it maybe costs me some stress, and then I get to do it. Or I might say, oh, okay, yeah, if you fight her, she's going to stab you and you're going to take level 2 harm, or you're going to have to push yourself, right? I have some options there, right? I can immediately declare the consequence before you get to act, or I can say you're going to have to push yourself in general. So there's some layers of options that I have. The threat roll is you can accomplish the thing, but you might suffer a consequence. This would be to even try the thing, you're going to have to suffer a consequence or push yourself. So that gives me that flexibility. Reduce consequence. When a consequence is number, you mean you lower it, right? So instead of the level 2 thing, you take the level 1 thing. Narrative focused threats require some nuance, right? Reduced effects means the blue coats haven't captured you, but they managed to corner you. Do you want to try and fight your way out, right? So there's a little bit of, you have to do a little bit more interpretation for narrative focused threats, but there's going to be more guidance later on. Here is a new thing called edge. When you roll more than 1 6, you gain an edge, which represents a spark of luck or tenacity you get by taking risks. You can spend that edge to get greater effect, a bonus die, you can help somebody, but any edge you have is lost when downtime starts, right? So you can't roll edge through to your next mission. Another game might also call this momentum, right? Because you carry it forward. Special cases. Most of the time, a standard threat roll is all you need. However, there are some special cases. If you're in a controlled position, if there's no impending danger, don't call for a threat roll. Just describe what they're able to do without taking a risk or paying a cost. If they want to achieve more, they can make a devil's bargain. Page 98, which is ahead. If the scoundrel is in a desperate position, right, outnumbered, outclassed, or badly impaired, they might need to make a desperate roll to avoid the threat. Desperate roll is all or nothing. 6 is a success, but 5 or less is that threat result, right? So this takes the 4-5 result and, it means that that this 1-3 result is instead 1-5. There's no middle version, right? You suffer the consequence. If you push yourself, reduce it. Suffer a reduced consequence or push yourself to avoid it, right? You don't get that option of push to avoid everything. It's succeed or take the thing, push to reduce it. And when you mark a desperate threat roll, or when you make a desperate threat roll, you still mark XP. That's similar to core blades. Just looking at this, fighting a gang, right? So this is similar stuff to desperate position. Fictional positioning and character abilities can mitigate desperate threats. If your character has a rifle and time to reload before 3 enforcers can reach them, then they're not to be or if they're not to be trifled with, it wouldn't be a desperate roll. It'd be a standard threat roll. And when you call for a desperate roll, it says to basically leave space if they want to try to take a different approach or say, actually, I don't want to try to do that, or I want to do a flashback. Sometimes you want to use an attribute for a threat roll. So this is, right, this says, quote, this works well when a character is trying to avoid a threat resulting from their own potential weaknesses. You might roll insight against threats involving disorientation, confusion, doubt, or uncertainty, prowess against pushing physical limits, resolve against temptation, so on and so forth. Quote, when Bazo stares me down, I hesitate. I might be too intimidated to stand up for him. I want to roll resolve and see what happens. This sounds like it's called by the player, but I could see the GM doing it as well, right? You're going to need to make a prowess roll, a prowess threat roll before you act because of how screwed up you are in injury. Using other ratings, you might roll tier when your clout or reputation is threatened, or you might use your lifestyle rating when their affluence or apparent wealth is key to avoiding a threat, right? Like buying somebody off, maybe. A threat roll usually just resolves the consequence of a threat. It doesn't bear on the effect of a scoundrel's own action. However, sometimes the success of an action seems unlikely or especially difficult. In this case, the GM can introduce the threat of failure. If you assign a 4-5 to a failure threat, your character's action has reduced effect. On 1-3, the action fails, right? So this is an option that's more like standard blades. So here's an example. This is a very long shot against a tiny target. You're not in danger, but I'm adding the threat of failure. You might miss, right? And so that threat is, it's not you do the thing, but there's a different threat is you might not do the thing. The threat is you might not accomplish it, right? And since you're no kind of sharpshooter, I think it's a desperate roll too. So that gives the GM some latitude for when it's not that the character couldn't accomplish it, it's that there is reasonable doubt of failure versus it's not that this roll is desperate, it's that you might just miss, right? When the only threat is uncertainty as opposed to some other consequence. So this option will let you make rolls that are more like earlier rolls or more like traditional action resolution rolls where you can succeed or fail versus the threat roll, which is more about do you avoid the consequence. So tonally, the threat roll presumes competence and that the player character will accomplish the thing that they're setting out to do. This threat of failure option then provides the space for tonal range where there's less of an expectation of automatic success. This gives you a couple of modes to play with, right? In a Genrenauts game, I might, right, if I'm going to make this up here, right, I might have a roll with confidence or a roll with uncertainty, right? A roll with confidence is, we know that you're good at this, or this is a genre where your ability to do the thing you're describing is almost never in question. It's more about what threat do you face. Or a character might have a special ability that says you make XYZ rolls with confidence, right? So that it's about avoiding the threat and not do you do the thing. Or I might say that I might have a threat roll and then like I give it a different name when there's a threat of failure. Effects and consequences. Here's a big chart. 4 levels of impact. This concretizes extreme effect. I like extreme effect. I think having it is good. Extreme effect is 4 harm. Extreme effect is 4 ticks. In other games, extreme becomes 5 ticks. Right? There's a scale up from 3 to 5. This keeps this linear scale, which I think does make sense, even if it's not as... Or it can be fun to get extreme effect and then you fill in 5 ticks. But so much of the clocks and math of blades is in 4s and 8s, so that it does make sense. It's 4s and 8s, and more broadly is in even numbers, right? The clocks are 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 generally, and so 4 ticks makes sense. Sometimes, right? The thing about extreme is if it gives you 5, 1 limited effect and 1 extreme effect is 6, which would be the equivalent of 2 great effects. Here, 1 extreme effect and 1 standard effect add up to 6 ticks. So this is, you could adjust this, but I see why it's 4 here, because then the math is all consistent, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. This is about describing effect. In most cases, you have to take a bigger risk to have greater effect. When opponents aren't matched, the more dangerous one gets more impact for less risk. An average duelist could face lethal harm from a master swordsman while threatening superficial cuts in return. Right? That's all consistent. You can get a few good cuts in, but he might overpower you and put the manacles on. Let's say you're doing harm 2 to him, and you might become restrained. Right, and so this does establish doing harm to adversaries, but I would generally apply 2 harm as 2 ticks on somebody's clock, unless there's really a reason why it would make sense to use harm instead. Demanding, okay. Devil's Bargain. So this is all still part of the action module, right? We're on page 99 and there's 118 pages, so this is going to keep going for a little while. I might start going a little bit faster. Devil's Bargain, this is a more broad system now, right? When a scoundrel wants something they can't simply achieve it, offer them a Devil's Bargain. You get it, but it costs you something, or you'll have to deal with a threat, right? You might have to mark stress, spend coin, lose item, lose rep, tick a clock, suffer harm, take heat, lose fashion status. Yeah, you can pry the window open and sneak in, simple enough, but here's a bit of noise, I'll tick the alert clock. You can just do it, but this thing. Now, if they don't want to, right, maybe they push themselves to avoid it, or maybe this becomes a threat roll. If a scoundrel is already facing a threat and making a roll and they want a better chance of success, they can ask for a Devil's Bargain to add an additional threat, giving them +1d, right? This is discussed earlier. After the roll, the player has to give the devil their due and assign one of the dice to each additional threat. You can steal the documents, but he has good security. You might get caught in the act. This Devil's Bargain can be used for basically anything, right? This is a way that the conversation takes shape. You can do X, but you might Y, or you can do X, but it will Y. You can do X, but it might Y is a threat roll. You can do X, but Y will happen. That's a Devil's Bargain, right? The uncertainty is in the threat roll. Okay, gathering information. So this is something I was very happy to see, because I think there has been a lot of confusion around gathering information across different Forged in the Dark games. And sometimes I have fallen into this uncertainty as well, and confusion. When a player wants to know something, tell them what's obvious to them, including what they know, what they intuit, and what they suspect, based on appropriate information for them, right? Playbook, background, heritage. Quote, you're a seasoned lurk, so you can spot every point of infiltration here, but the upper balcony looks the most promising. There's a walkway, but of course the count is supposed to have good security. If there's more to discover, ask them if they want to know more and what their character does to find out. So this is telling the GM, hey, when characters are gathering information, just go ahead and tell them some stuff based on what makes sense, what they know, what they intuit, and what they suspect. And then if they want more, you ask them what they're doing to find out. So based on the approach, you might offer a devil's bargain, a cost or a threat, give them a lead, or ask them to start a long-term project to investigate. Right? So the cost would be, yes, you can find out more, but people are going to notice and you're going to take heat. Or, right, that's a cost. Devil's bargain with a threat. You might find out how to get in, but they're going to start noticing that people are poking around, and I'm going to put clocks on an alert. I'm going to put ticks on an alert clock. Or you might, right, you can press the topic and get information out of somebody at the bar by like getting rough, but you're going to get beat up in return because there's going to be a bar fight and you're going to take this harm. Again, this is all playing back and forth in the conversation really tightly without needing to move more fully into the mechanics layer, where the mechanics are reflecting and then will reflect on the fiction, but are a little bit more, they're a little bit less fully in the fiction, right? They reflect it. Staying in the conversation means you're in the fiction and the GM's like, yes, but this, right? And it gestures toward mechanics, but we're still kind of in the middle space between fiction and mechanics. Whereas if this goes to a roll, it's, I do this thing, oh, but there's this threat, and then we make a roll, and then we come back to establish how to process mechanics into fiction, and then we go back into fiction, right? We're weaving back and forth to tie these two together, but sometimes you don't have to go all the way to breaking out the dice. Leads. Give the player a lead when they're not in the position to gather the information yet, but but they have a lead, right? I'm not giving it to you immediately, but you're getting more than you'd had before, or here's who to go to for it. And if it's a bigger thing, it's a long-term project instead, right? So you start going through the Leviathan Hunter's Captain's Log and realize that it's written in code. You can study it, but you'll need to work on it as a long-term clock, right? You can get the information, but it's going to take you longer. This is a project. I'm just going to browse through what's left real quick to remind myself. Right, so teamwork, that's system changes, threats, playbook changes. This is all there. Designer notes. Okay, so I'm going to skip over a lot of this specific playbook stuff. So we'll do teamwork, and then we'll go down to designer's notes. With this rules module, there are three teamwork methods: assist, cover, and coordinate. Assist. If you're in position to assist, protect them or do something to better set up their action, tell them what you do and what you're doing to help. You could give +1d to a roll, reduce the severity of a consequence, improve their possession or effect, more details or questions when they gather information. Oh, if you're going to ask around, I'm going to go with you and look scary, and that's going to intimidate people into talking, right? That might be how you assist. It doesn't yet say whether you have to mark stress to do this. The GM has final say on what benefit you get. They either say you accomplish it or tell you what you need to do to get into it, or offer a devil's bargain, pay a cost, or face a threat to do it. Right, and here's an example. As the spirit begins to possess Arcee, I grab her hands and shout over the howling wind, don't lose yourself. So this is this is a big swing kind of a help, right? Can I improve position from desperate to risky? Yes, but you have to push yourself to do it, right? And so that's the cost, right? It may cost you stress. You have to push yourself could be a much higher cost, right? Helping is normally 1 stress. Pushing yourself could be up to 3. You can also help another player by giving them an edge to grant +1d, right? If you have that edge from rolling multiple 6s. So your crit can turn into an edge and then you give it to somebody as a bonus. To cover for someone, describe the action you take so the teammate doesn't have to face a particular threat. Right, so this is, here is a threat you're facing, and then someone says, well, what if I do X so they don't have to deal with it? That's really great. Again, offers you a devil bargain, pay a cost or face a threat. If you're already in danger making a threat roll, covering for someone adds additional threat. I take out my second pistol and cock the hammer. Let's make a run for it, and I'll cover you, I say. Okay, so you're facing two threats. The first is severe harm from the foghounds shooting back at you. The second is failure. You might not cover Sawtooth, and he comes under fire too. Right? You're trying to accomplish two things. You're trying to address two threats. You can coordinate in two ways: group action and divide and conquer. Divide and conquer is new. When the team coordinates, designate a leader. They can push themselves on behalf of any character who's acting with the team. If everyone faces the same threat, each player rolls to see how much the threat affects you individually. A benefit from a group action is you can increase in scale. So a leader can push themselves on behalf of anybody, right, to account for their consequences. If a team faces a variety of threats, the players can play to their own strengths, each tackling a threat with their own action. Okay, while you prowl past the sentries, I'll finesse the boat into position so you can drop down with the loot. And then maybe Ruby can survey the canal. Teammates may also be able to assist or cover during a coordinated action. If I use Tempest to summon a big fog bank, can I assist everyone who's sneaking in? Maybe give them a control position. You can, but I think giving them +1 to their rolls makes more sense. They're not invisible, just concealed. So this is some mix-up to the assist rules. Instead of cover someone, pay the cost or face that. Yeah, this just rearranges some things. I don't hate it. I'm going to need to chew on it a little bit more to process all of it. Divide and conquer feels a little bit more like opening up the kind of group action idea to something that I might think of as maybe being a little bit more analogous to a skill challenge in D&D, I think introduced in 4th edition, and then there's versions that are in 5th edition, like homebrew kinds of stuff. Divide and conquer is more like that. Group action is more like, this is a group stealth roll. But in this version, right, we all roll prowl. Threat for each of you is 2 ticks on the alert clock. Make your threat roll. Oh, well, you're facing a consequence, but because I'm the leader, I get to push myself on your behalf. Right, so the costs for it may be greater. But yeah, well, right, because in a normal group action, you pay 1 stress for each player who didn't succeed. So this maybe increases. I think this does increase the danger, the cost of a group action, which I think is maybe depends on tone for your game, right? I like the idea of being able to cover for other people, but it makes group actions really, really strong. So that's probably something else I want to chew on. Divide and conquer, I think, is easier for me to understand because I can interpret it through some other ideas. And then we scroll through all this. Designer's notes. I'm so glad this is in here. Thank you, John. Right. Innovations. This I didn't really look at as much, right? This is inventions. Harm. In watching a lot of actual play videos, I noticed that some players and GMs forget to apply harm penalties. I added a house rule to my own games for the end of session XP, including harm alongside trauma as a way to gain XP if it causes problems. This module expands on that idea, so harm is more centered in the fiction and players are rewarded when it comes into play. That's all a direct quote. I think that makes a lot of sense. Trauma. Some groups find trauma too punishing, especially if they misinterpret the rule and knock a character out of the whole score rather than just the present situation, right? So that's clarification of which one it is in the core game. It's just the present situation. This module addresses that and adds a possibility of recovery, something I've done in my own home games and seen other GMs do. Absolutely makes sense. Load. Sometimes in play, it strains credulity when a scoundrel is suddenly wearing full armor and hauling a demolitions kit out of nowhere. Absolutely, right? That makes sense. That's why we get conspicuous and discreet. And then the idea of heavy items. Advancement. This can slow down advancement and make it harder to get those to go deep or wide, right? As I said. And it integrates with the other things that increase XP gain and then you can change the size of the advancement clocks to tweak costs, right? If all the advancement clocks are 4, then it's not as much more as this base module, but it does mean that it's more expensive to go from 3 to 4 in an action than it is to go from 1 to 2, because you're still having to fill these clocks, versus the linear scale of you fill this track and you can make 1 advance in this category regardless. And downtime. This modifies downtimes to be diceless, so they're more reliable. Quote, I've seen disappointed faces from players when the downtime rolls didn't go well and they felt like opportunities were wasted. Totally understandable. Right? Payoff goes up. There are more ways to spend coin. This references that they give out more coin than many Blades GMs. Tying the gain of rep to gaining heat means there's an incentive to make things a bit noisy and chaotic, but you're drawing attention. Recovery is a little bit less punishing, which is a common complaint about the original mechanic. In this module, you can more reliably heal in 1 downtime cycle, assuming you have the funds to pay for it. Training is a big change. Some people didn't connect with the way that growth and change happens. This is more rooted in the fiction. Removing training as a source of XP, the character advancement is slowed down a little bit, which can be good for long-form games. Action, this is a lot of stuff. Quote, lots of stuff changed in the action system as I've tweaked and modified for my Blades games over the years. Some rough edges are smoothed down to speed up play and reduce frustrating interactions. I hope they'll play help out in your games. Threat roll is a refinement of the resistance roll. Rather than see if you can do it, this is about avoiding outcomes. They're often in danger not because they can't do a thing, but because they can, right? You can do it, but you might X. This is kind of how Harper runs Blades. Harper had earlier made some videos on YouTube about some of the ways that he runs stuff, providing some guidance for folks where there were instances of like, oh, okay, people are playing it like this. I had intended it like this. I want to provide information just in case that's right. People are doing something else because of uncertainty rather than because of intention. It requires the GM to describe it out beforehand. They don't have to invent a complication after the fact, right? You think through the complication as part of the process of designing the role, instead of not worrying, like having to think about it, but then you have to think about it all of a sudden, right? So you have to do a little bit more work up front more consistently, but you're not then surprised. Desperate Roll is much harder. And then here's some credit to Other Kind by Vincent Baker and Cyrun by Magay Baker. It's also in Ghost Echo and Danger Protocol, right? It's also in this, but I'm pretty sure Vincent and Meg came up with it first, right? This is just giving credit where you think credit is due, and better to be safe than sorry. Control Position, this is like, hey, maybe you don't have to call for a roll here. And then Devil's Bargain, this is broadening the idea of Devil's Bargains. Resolve threats. Few role-playing games have mechanics that directly impact a character's inner thoughts. If that's the case, right, some players are averse to rolling dice about those things. You can back off resolve rolls. However, if people are up for it, this can be fun, right? A character might roll to steel their nerve to commit murder, or to see if they hesitate in the face of overwhelming odds, right? This gives you kind of a little bit like a panic or a fear mechanic if you want. Again, this kind of speaks to tone. And then push, right? I've seen some players be disappointed when they spend 2 stress to push and then all their dice rolled high, right? It didn't feel like it was worth it. This takes place after your roll, once you know how well the roll went, right? You only push when you need to because of a bad roll or to activate a special ability, is the quote. And since it's after the threat roll, combining this with resistance made sense, right? Because resistance is already the reaction to, oh no, there's a consequence. What do you want to do about it? So then instead pushing yourself. And no more flub resistance rolls that suddenly cost you 5 stress out of nowhere, is the quote there. By limiting the range of possible stress costs, characters can be a little bit more daring. Yeah, I agree. That does sound fun. This is some clarity on gather info and teamwork. I usually see teamwork that's organic and flows with the system, which can cause a bit of a stumble when suddenly a specific teamwork mechanic needs to be referenced. With this revision, I try to capture more what I see people doing and kind of integrating everything into one another. Cool, that makes sense. These are all really interesting. I think the action, right, this action change and harm are probably the ones I'm most interested in thinking about right away, but I will also be thinking about downtime and load. Load, I think I may agree with so much that I just adopt pretty consistently and then think about how I want to adapt it in my Genrenauts game. Trauma, I already have a different system that I'm using, so I don't know that I'm not necessarily going to adopt this one because I've already addressed that idea with other design ideas. Not that this isn't good, it's just kind of more of like a parallel evolution thing. Advancement, I think the clocks thing is pretty cool, and I do like that it means that it's no longer that it costs more to get higher level upgrades, and maybe this is smoother than just increasing the clock size. I might have to do some math and think things through about that a little bit more. I haven't looked at this innovations thing, but I think it's more specific to Duskwall and Blades. I don't have an elaborate crafting system in Genrenauts because I would rather it be a little bit more hand-wavy, because I tend to tire pretty quickly of crafting systems because I find that they get really involved, and it's almost always one player who's excited about crafting, and so then there's they're playing a game by themselves, or it's just them and the GM, and that can be tricky unless everybody else is also bought in on the results or the process, which ideally you get, but doesn't always necessarily happen. Okay, so I've been talking for an hour and 40 minutes straight, and so I think I'm going to stop there. I do encourage folks, I'm going to scroll again, so close your eyes if you need to. All the way up here, right, here's the TOC. So there's setting stuff, invocations, factions, heritage, backgrounds, and the catalyst. This is a big setting thing. And then, so we didn't look at any of this, right? So almost half the book we didn't look at all. And then we looked at these modules, but, skimmed through a few things. This book is only $10. I would have easily paid $20 just for the PDF based on all the stuff that is in here. So, right, I showed a decent amount of it back and forth and quickly. If you got a lot, or you got something out of this for your own design or for your understanding of Blades, please go just buy that book if it's not a financial stressor to do so, right? John Harper has been incredibly generous in putting Blades in the Dark in a bunch of charity bundles over the years. I think there is some chance this book may show up in some of those. I cannot predict it, but I just want to reinforce for folks that I have already gotten a lot out of this. And if you are a game designer that's watching this and you're thinking about these ideas for Forge in the Dark, I would encourage you to consider buying this book as well, to kind of provide that financial support and recognition of all this extra work that Harper has put into this expansion to continue developing Blades in the Dark, and to provide a lot of mechanical support for potential alternatives and other design branches or approaches that folks can take in Forge in the Dark. I do note that thus far, as I have seen, this stuff is not officially, that's not what I'm trying to do at all. No AI assistant, please go away forever. None of this stuff is technically in the Forge in the Dark SRD yet, unless John has already updated it and I didn't notice, which maybe they have. So on this stuff, so far, I think this doesn't count as the same stuff for, I'm going to use the Forge in the Dark SRD. I would be surprised if Harper was angry at people for taking these ideas and then adapting them into their own Forge in the Dark game, but I cannot speak for them, so I'm not going to try to. If and when I'm incorporating stuff into my own Forge in the Dark design, I will either want to reach out to Harper directly, or I will look and see if he's provided any specific guidance on, here's what I have to say about what I feel, or like how I feel about people using stuff from deep cuts in their Forge in the Dark designs. right? Harper has been a very generous designer and supports a lot of other designers. So I would be surprised if he was really protective of this and unhappy about people using it. But again, I cannot speak for them because they are their own person, and I will defer to whatever their preference is. So that's that. Thank you to John Harper for making this cool thing to continue supporting Blades in the Dark after seven years of this game being out, plus or minus a few months. I am sure that for people who are playing Blades specifically, all the setting stuff is going to be really cool. I'm excited to go and take a look at it at some other time, and definitely excited to return to all these system modules again and think about how I might want to use them in Blades and or in other Forge in the Dark games that I'm running as kind of house rules, right? Applying these to other existing Forge in the Dark games as house rules, or applying them in my own design. So if you want to see if you want to see other stuff that I do, you can go to my website, or you can go to, I'm finding my itch.io. Pardon me, I'm just making sure that I have the exact right thing so I'm not leading you to somewhere wrong. Right, my own itch.io is here, and then I'm going to find where you can buy this specific book. You can buy this specific book at johnharper.itch.io/deep-cuts. Or if you go and find John's Twitter or Blue Sky or other social handles, they should be linking to this. This was $10 in PDF when I bought it last night. Again, extremely worth it. Would have paid twice the cost. May in the future buy gift versions for people to continue providing financial compensation in recognition of all the work that Harper has done in developing and releasing this, right? Because you have to do all the graphic design stuff, right? This is a for reals ebook. This is not just a big text file, right? So all that formatting and design stuff is extra work on top of the design work to create the technology and the ideas, and then the writing to convey them. So that is all of that. If you like this and want to see me do more analysis streams about RPGs and things, please let me know. Share these videos with people. Shout about game design things that you love. Comment on YouTube, any number of those things, and I would be grateful for all of that. And I would like to do more design things, but it's going to be a question of how much bandwidth I have, right? Doing Daggerheart work and then doing other projects of my own, and then trying to figure out when and where I have time for other things, because I have too many interests and not enough time, and unfortunately have only limited energy, as any of us do, facing our own our own various challenges, and so on and so forth. And now I'm rambling and getting additionally sentimental, whatever, it doesn't matter. So that's that. I've been talking quite fast, and I apologize for folks for whom that is a bother, as I slow down to give myself the greater ability to cool down and take us out here. I will go to my ending section, which has music again. Thank you all for watching and hanging out with me, and I will see you some other time.